Our guest on Baby Boomers Guide to Life in the 21st Century today is just before becoming well known as one of Australia's first sex therapists. She then had a long career as a social commentator, mainly on gender issues, and is now making YouTube videos about demonisation of men. Her new book, #Men2, will be published in December. Good morning, Bettina. How are you today?
Very good, Jeff.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
We're talking about sex and relationships as you age, but doesn't sex come to a sudden end as you age?
No, of course not. There was a famous author called Alex Comfort, back in the 1960s, I think it was, wrote a book called The Joy of Sex. And he said, the things that stop you from enjoying sex in old age are the same things that stop you from riding a bicycle. Bad health, thinking it's silly, and no bicycle. And I think that sort of sums it up. Because there are a lot of things that have changed since the 1960s to make it easier, so all of those particular issues become easier for people. I mean, the bad health issue was a really significant one, particularly, I think, back to the 1970s, for instance, when I was first working as a sex therapist. And we had a major problem then with older men having trouble with erections and no solution for them. We thought it was all in their heads, and it turned out it was all in their bodies because we've discovered a huge amount since then about what happens to this wonderful erectile mechanism as men get older, and now we have the solutions to fix that. And it's just been a revolution for men. And similarly for women, I think there's a lot we've learned about helping keeping women's bodies functioning well and supplying them with the hormones they need to keep, everything well lubricated down there. And so there's a whole lot of health issues we've sorted out, which is a good start. And then the second thing about thinking it's silly, I mean, one of the reasons sex came to an end was an assumption that older people didn't have sex. And I think that's changed dramatically, that most people realise you can go on having sex all your life if you want to. But we still have a problem with the bicycle problem, and I think that's probably the major one for most people. You have to, obviously you can have sex on your own, but when it comes to having sex with a partner, sadly a lot of people don't have partners through to old age, or have a partner who isn't interested in sex anymore. To me, those are the really biggest issues preventing people from enjoying sex right through to, their final years.
So there's mismatched desire, and there are people who are becoming single again later in their own lives.
But that's changed enormously too. I spent 5 years as an online dating coach, and I was very excited when I heard about online dating, which has been around for over a decade now, and that's revolutionised the possibilities of new relationships for older people. Once when you were single, you were widowed or you were divorced in your 50s, 60s, 70s, it was very difficult for people to meet people outside their immediate social circle, and that was often pretty limited. They often had mainly couple friends, and you were stuck with, the people who were around at the time. Whereas now there's this opportunity for people of all ages to use online dating, and that's how most people are meeting new partners. I met my partner online after many years of online dating. That was 4 years ago now, and I would never. He lives right up the Central Coast, and we would never in a million years have met in normal life. So it can work very well.
It's a new way of doing the same old thing.
Yeah, a very new way, and it's very confronting for many people. I don't do online dating coaching anymore. A lot of people find it very confronting to start doing it. But once you get used to it, it's an extraordinary opportunity to meet a whole range of people. And maybe you only end up with a nice warm hand to hold in the movie theatre or someone to have coffee with or whatever. But a lot of people are meeting new partners, throughout their lives through online dating.
And people do want to couple up even as they get older. So how important are intimate relationships as we age?
Particularly important in a way for men. It's important for men and women, but women tend to be better connected socially. Women tend to have a stronger a friendship network and often, for various reasons, are, more intertwined with their families, their grown-up families, than men are. I mean, I've worked in recent years working a lot with men and advocating for men, and it really worries me how lonely a lot of men are. The highest suicide rate in Australia is elderly men. I think men could very easily get extraordinarily socially isolated once they retire and lose their work networks. And that's a major problem. And my experience with the dating coaching was always that men tend to be much less content on their own than women are. The men would grizzle to me saying, I'm supposed to be in the buyer's market here. I mean, certainly the numbers are in favour of older men because there's a real disparity in the numbers of available single men to women. I mean, many more women than men. And yet the men would say to me, well, why are women still so fussy? I'm a perfectly decent bloke. Why aren't they interested in me? And, of course, sometimes they were, but women tend to have more contented lives as single people than men do, and many men are very keen to replace the partner they've lost, whether through divorce or widowhood, and women, unless it's really enhancing their lives, they won't leap into a new permanent relationship.
Very much so. I gather that there is a lot of research that shows that single men, particularly older men, do not fare as well as single older women. Yeah,
that's right. And it's also things like creating a home. I mean, we still have a very traditional lives, particularly, I suppose, in the older generations where usually it's the woman who creates the nest, turning it into something beyond just a place where you can live to somewhere which is really comfortable and nice place to be. And I mean, it's extraordinary how many men I've met in my life who are single men who don't put the effort into creating a comfortable home and don't really know how to go about doing that. Some do, and some are brilliant at it. And there are plenty of men who, live very happy lives on their own, but there are an awful lot who aren't. And it's also the issue of not having enough to do. I mean, the women often would complain to me about meeting men who wanted them to entertain them and men who didn't have enough in their lives other than hitting little white balls into holes, when men who retire and then all they've got is golf or whatever it is. And very often, for complex reasons, I mean, women's lives tend to be so different from men's, and many women, of course, have children and then come back into the workforce. So they have a new burst of enthusiasm about their careers, and whereas men have often been stuck in the same careers for an awfully long time, and women are much more likely to get involved in other social activities. I've done a lot of research on this over the years, and so the women have their book clubs and their knitting clubs and their whatever it is, and men very often, don't have nearly as much opportunity for social interaction. I mean, one of the things that's helping with that, of course, is the men's shed movement, which I've always been very enthusiastic about, giving men an opportunity to connect together and have special time with other men, which gives them a chance to talk about things that they don't want to talk about in front of women. I made a video last year because I was just shocked because I discovered that the men's shed movement is under pressure in some cases to allow women inside the men's sheds, which is just amazingly crazy in my view. Here was, the men's shed is all about providing special men with the opportunity to just be with themselves and to support each other and to have conversations that they maybe don't have when women are around. And here are women's sheds, women barging into that as well. I mean, I just think it's been quite extraordinary how women feel entitled to take over any aspect of men's lives which might once have been reserved for men. And of course, we're still happy to hang on to our little privileges when it comes to, all women swimming sessions at a swimming pool or women gyms or whatever it is. But we want to be part of anything that men ever set up for themselves. I think it's just crazy.
There's a place, do you suppose, for continuing the idea of secret women's business and secret men's business?
Oh, of course there is. And the men's shed was supposed to be about secret men's business, and in the sense that it's understood that some men will have conversations with other men more easily when there aren't women around. And yeah, and I think that applies to women too. There are women who want to go to a gym session where there aren't men looking at them, where they feel maybe they're overweight, maybe they're not comfortable, doing exercise in front of men. I mean, there are reasons why women would want to do some things on their own and why men should too. And I just hate that sort of bullying that's going on in our society, where women in particular are really, I mean, they've managed to push their way into every aspect of our workplaces, and often to the detriment of those workplaces. I had a letter the other day from a policeman saying he was just appalled that the entry standards into the police have been so lowered when it comes to physical fitness, and you don't have to climb fences anymore as a inspiring policeman. And as you said, I mean, it's not as if the burglars don't climb fences. So if a woman policeman happens to be charging after him, and can't go over the fence, it's bad luck for the rest of us. Or you don't have to carry a man's body weight anymore. I mean, I just think this is one of the reasons I've got involved in advocacy for men, is I think there are aspects of the feminist movement which have gone far too far and which are advantaging women at the expense of men in all sorts of areas of law and regulations. And the majority of people don't agree with this, and yet the noisy minority group that is feminism, is having an extraordinary influence on our society.
Well, we're talking about a cohort of people who were living and forming during the 60s and all of the revolutions that took place, sexual revolutions, political revolutions, taking power, and of course the feminist revolution. Men who've grown up in these periods of, on the one hand, supportive for the most part of these movements, but they're not necessarily very well equipped for dealing with them.
Well, I think most men and women are not supportive of what's happened to these movements. I mean, we were all celebrating when women back in the women's movement back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s was all about opportunities for women to be alongside men, to have equality with men. Sorry, I mean the idea was always about equality and an equal playing field. Feminism today has got nothing to do with that. It's all about giving women advantages that men don't have. And it's interesting. I've just been writing recently about a SBS program on sexism that is due to be broadcast in a few weeks' time, and I was invited to be part of that program last year because they'd done a big survey, and they found that most people. Firstly, they found only a tiny group of people subscribe to feminism now, 19%, 14% in the older age groups. That 45% of people feel feminism has gone too far. 75% feel that men suffer from sexism too. And they finally persuaded me to do an interview for this program on the basis that someone had to represent that majority view, which thinks this is all going far too far. And I did my interview, and now the program is going ahead. It's called Is Australia Sexist? And, of course, it's the usual male-bashing feminist dogma, claiming this is a horrible sexist society and that all women have a terrible time, and they show a little girl in tears because she'll never earn as much as a man, and the compares in tears saying, she can't bear the thought of her children growing up in this society. I mean, it's total rubbish. It's not what most people believe and observe around them. And yet, typically we have a government-funded public broadcaster promoting this feminist rubbish.
Yes, well, you are controversial, and that's one of the reasons you make such an excellent guest, Tina.
Good. Anyway, so that, to me, feminism was also about celebrating women's strengths. Remember Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar? It was about the fact that women could be powerful and independent. That's what we wanted, us women back in the good old days. Not women being victims, not women always turning around and claiming we had we needed special protection. I mean, I think most people looking at the hashtag Me Too movement are absolutely horrified at this being used to constantly present women as, fragile, fainting couch creatures, endlessly in need of protection from a dirty joke or a man looking at them in the wrong way. I mean, what in the hell is going on here?
Well, perhaps the 60s and the 70s were political and sexual revolutions. Now maybe we're having the cultural revolutions.
But it's not. It's a revolution led by a tiny minority group, silencing the majority of people who want normal male-female relationships, who don't want this dysfunctional little group determining whether we're allowed to have a man compliment us on the way we dress.
And this is an issue for older people who are trying to form relationships too?
Well, it's an issue for everybody, I feel. I think there must be a lot of older men who are really nervous someone's going to turn around from 40 years ago in their past and accuse them of looking at them the wrong way or making a sexual joke or putting a hand on the knee. Where it's a very strange time we live in.
Older people do have problems that they have to overcome forming new relationships. And
obviously they do, and I don't think they're particularly different from problems faced by anybody forming new relationships. I mean, you feel the same way putting yourself forward as a man or a woman and asking someone to go out with you as you did when you were 20, even if you are 60. But what's different, I mean, it was interesting, people who've been married for 30, 40 years and then go back out there looking for a new partner, they'll find, I mean, the whole dating world is very different. Online dating, of course, is extremely different from, the business at maybe 40 years ago, waiting for someone to ask you out on a date. One of the things I used to have to teach women is that women have to take the initiative these days. They can't wait to be asked. In fact, there are websites, there are particular dating sites which require women to always make the first move, which I think is a really good idea. But there are other sites where if women aren't in there approaching men, they won't do very well at all. And they can't just wait for the men to be interested in them, and particularly if they're interested in the more eligible men. And so, all those sorts of rules have changed a lot. And, of course, the issue of sex, which is an interesting one, of the assumptions about how you progress to a sexual relationship have changed dramatically. And a lot of women in particular find that difficult. I mean, there's the joke about online dating that around the third or fourth stage, either it progresses, the assumption is either it progresses to an intimate relationship or it's not going anywhere. And there is that. It's a really accelerated process. And I worked with lots of women who get very offended at the idea. Someone might give you a kiss on the end of a first date when you've only just met. And all of that they find very confronting, let alone deciding whether they're wanting to go to bed with this man after a few dates. And you don't have to do that. I've dealt with people and I've worked with clients who went out with a man for a year, one in particular, before they decided to get intimate. And it's quite possible to do that. But given that a lot of other people are tending to move pretty quickly into a more intimate relationship, there's a lot of pressure on you in that situation.
So you do get older, you are more experienced, but that doesn't mean that starting to date again isn't a difficult and a scary thing.
Yeah, you can be more experienced with one person. You can have had a 30-year relationship with one person, and it's a huge shock to go out and have to start again meeting new people. But it's really confronting for older men and women. I mean, women often are very nervous about the horrifying thought of taking off your clothes for someone you don't know. And I remember I certainly went through my own nervousness around that issue. You think he's going to run screaming from the room when he takes one look at you. And I've talked to women who endlessly clutched, towels and sheets around their necks and hid themselves. And, this self-consciousness about our bodies is a major issue, particularly for women. And I suppose the really obvious one for men is the erection problem, and the fact that if you're ever going to have trouble with erections, it's going to be with a new woman, because you're going to be anxious and you may not have been in that situation for a long time, so you don't really know how your equipment's going to sort of stand up And I think that makes it particularly difficult for men. I once talked to a lovely man who sort of nailed this whole problem. He'd been online dating for a long time, and he had what he called a capricious penis. It didn't always behave. It was rather unpredictable. And he was really upfront with the women, and he would say, when, he'd been dating them for a bit and they felt the relationship was going to be intimate, he'd say, look, I have this issue, this is how my body tends to behave when I'm with someone new, but he said, I'm a really good lover and I know how to please you, so don't worry, if it doesn't work out in terms of me getting erections, I'll look after you. And he hardly ever had a knockback in that situation. He found that anyone who was thinking of getting intimate with him would usually be really comfortable, particularly because he'd been prepared to talk about it. And one of the issues we all have is our nervousness of having proper conversations around sex. I've always said to men and women, don't guess, don't feel, I wonder if I invite him for coffee, he might think I want him to have sex with him. You talk about things like that, and you say, look, it'd be great after the movies if you want to come and have coffee, but I'm not ready to leave into bed with you. You can have those sorts of conversations, and it makes it easier for men and women if you do.
So having the conversation is a very important part of the whole process of forming a new relationship.
A lot of us just aren't used to having those conversations. I mean, I remember in my own case, when my first relationship, after a long marriage, my first relationship, when I was single, and I was very nervous about that and so on, and this lovely man was just being very careful and comfortable with me, and eventually we were on a long walk, and I joked to him and said, I'm going to need the WD-40, it's so long since I've had sex. And he said, don't worry, I'm a very patient man. And it was such a good answer.
A very good answer. And that goes back to what the author of The Joy of Sex said about your health being one of the big three. You did mention that the second one is that you would fear that you would making a fool of yourself. And Steve Biddulph, in something that you sent me to read, mentioned that most men are still basically ashamed of their sexual feelings.
Well, most men and women are nervous around this whole issue. Of course, we live in a society where men's sexuality is constantly denigrated. Men are always in trouble over sex these days, and I don't think that's helping men. And the whole business of, when you get sexual consent, and are you really supposed to say to a woman, can I kiss you, can I touch you, can I stroke your breast? I mean, all of that applies presumably to the 80-year-olds as well as to the 20-year-olds. And it's madness, this idea of prescribing our behaviour in that sort of way. And particularly the older generation of women. There are many women I know who wouldn't be remotely interested in a man who constantly asks for permission every inch of the way. They'd feel he was a total nerd. Because many women still expect the man to seduce them. So what do you do with that? So
we still have expectations. We still carry our baggage, our values.
And you want, many women want a man who acts as if he knows what he's doing. I mean, and obviously, men can, an experienced man can read body signals and can know if he's stroking your neck, whether you're appreciating it or not, or whether you're trying to push away from him. I mean, there's ways of doing this that don't fit in with the feminist prescribe, asking for permission, ticking off the boxes. The fact is that this whole sexual talk around sexual consent is based on a notion of sex that's got nothing to do with real life. And most of us find what they're suggesting to be appropriate behaviour something we're not interested in.
Well, we have our vulnerabilities as we age, but what are our strengths as we age and we try and form new relationships and intimate relationships?
The wonderful thing is you get over yourself. I mean, the fact that you tend not to take life as seriously. I think most of us, luckily, acquire some confidence along the way and don't sweat the small stuff nearly as much. And, if we can get over our initial self-consciousness, which is understandable, then, we're in I think, a much better position to really appreciate the joys of relationships, the joys of sex, because we know how precious it is. We've lived long lives. We've had a lot of times where we've felt very lonely in a marital bed or whatever it is, And I think to appreciate the good things, appreciate even a very wrinkled hand stroking your back can be a wonderful thing,
So even though we might have had a vigorous sex life as younger people, it still can be enriching.
Oh, absolutely. And from women's point of view, we often, those of us who've had a good sex life are in a position to, we know our bodies, we know what we like, we often have the confidence to tell the man how to make love to us properly. I mean, that sort of life experience can be invaluable when it comes to starting new relationships. And it applies to sex, but also applies, hopefully, to conducting civilized, loving relationships where we know how to deal with conflict and we don't bottle things up and we can talk about the hard stuff. And, many of us have had relationships that have failed along the way, and hopefully we've learned something from them as well.
Well, Bettina, what are the key messages you want to send to older Australians about sexuality and relationships as they age?
Oh, I think my main message, as is always my main message, is optimism, is to look forward to pleasure and the extraordinary pleasure of rediscovering love, rediscovering sexual relationships when you're very much older, and perhaps at a time when you didn't think it could ever happen to you again. Falling in love again is the most extraordinary thing. And it can happen to any of us. Lightning can strike 2 or 3, 4, 5 times in our lives if we're very lucky.
Do you think, Tina, that ageing can be fun?
Oh, I think ageing has huge advantages. I mean, obviously the end point is rather difficult to contemplate, but there are real advantages to the process, as well as obviously downsides. It's always disconcerting to look in the mirror and think, who's that old woman?
Yes, but it's a bit confronting getting out of the shower and seeing how things have gone south.
Yeah, and let alone showing it to someone else. You can get through that, let me tell you.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Okay, thanks a lot.